right. So, good afternoon. If Daniel was here, he would say, because I saw him speaking many times after lunch, that he was given the great task of keeping people awake after eating. And so today the burden's on me to keep everybody awake, and not only like having lunch, but like eating feijoada. In other words, brutal.
You got your work cut out for you.
Brutal. All right, so I'll do my best. Um, we had an opportunity for the ones who were not here to talk this morning about the law of love. And as I mentioned before, when I put this work together, it was meant to be in two parts. And so after I finished the first part, I said, what else can I say about love? And my intent, original intent, was to address Christ's invitation to love our enemies. And as I mentioned this morning, I thought there was too much of a stress for us right now because in looking at the whole thing with the elections, I'm like, oh my goodness, we need to learn to love one another, our friends first, and then later on think about these more complex issues. So I thought, I went back to the Gospel of Luke in this passage that's like really well known, where on one occasion, let me see if I get this right, on one occasion, an expert in the laws stood up to test Jesus. And teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? How do you read it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So I thought maybe this can be a good starting point for our reflection. And Jesus will say to that, you have answered correctly, do this and you will live. So the invitation here, the first part of the invitation is to love God. But many people sometimes come to me and say, how do I love God? Because God is so far away. People have this perception that God is too big, is too unknown, is too far. And so they say sometimes when they come to fraternal counseling, I really want to love God, but I don't know how to love God. And in fact, the question, in question number 3 of the Spirit's book, the Spirits tell us that God transcends the human language and our ability to, I'm not doing this, right?
No, sorry.
And it's not like a physical effect either. There's actually an incarnate person who is doing that. I just want to be sure. Because I see here on my peripheral vision that things are happening over there, and I know my thumb is up here, not moving. So I'm like, all right. So anyways, so in question number 3 of the Spirit's book, the Spirits tell us that God does transcend human language and our ability to understand. We really cannot comprehend God at this point. And that in question number 4, the Spirits will tell us that to believe in God, we need to behold the works of creation. So usually I tell people, what is your relationship with God? How do you relate to God? And I like to share my experience, right? So a lot of times when I live in a very, very beautiful neighborhood, one that has many churches. And at the corner of my house, there is a church, a beautiful church. And I walk my kids 1 block from the door of my house to the church where they go to school. And so early in the morning, I see the sun rising behind the church. And in the afternoon, sometimes I drive into that street and the sun is setting behind the other side of the church. And the image of the sun and the church and the neighborhood and the trees always, always reports me to God. Or sometimes I am sitting on the table at the end of a given day, having dinner with my family, which doesn't happen that often because my son has a very busy evening. Every evening he practices gymnastics from 5:30 to 8. So we have dinner at different times. So sometimes in the weekends we have a chance to sit together. And many, many times in those moments, whether I express that or not, I have the feeling of the presence of God in that meal, in that moment. So the experience of God comes through the appreciation of God's creations and God's creatures, right? We are God's creation. So whether you're looking at the nature or the appreciation of the other, your neighbor, there is God. So how do we get closer to God? We get closer to God by becoming closer to the creation, by becoming closer to one another. So the text says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So the very beginning starts with ourselves, loving ourselves, right? And what does that mean? Because I will be able to love my neighbor to the extent that I learn to love myself. To the extent that you are rigid and critic of others is the same extent that you're rigid and critic with yourself in first place. So the more that we are loving towards ourselves and the more we are flexible and the more that we're able to embrace our own humanity, the more we can also connect with people wherever they are in their humanity and their level of awareness. So the thing is that when it comes to loving ourselves and we ask, where are we as humanities in this exercise of loving ourselves? And if you look at the scientific and psychological data, we're not doing very well. Depression is pretty epidemic in our society, and we suffer from incredible low self-esteem. We live in a society that is permeated by the sense of low self-esteem and a sense of scarcity. Of a scarcity that comes from our disconnection from God, from our disconnection from our essence. So there are self-esteem, the concept of self-esteem, right? When we look at self-esteem, what goes under self-esteem? So people's sense of self-worth, so my value, how I perceive my own value as a human being, but also how competent do I feel in different domains of my life. So am I a competent professional, right? Or some people say, I can never have a child because I'll never be a good mother. So you don't feel like that you are competent enough to raise a child. A lot of people won't have children out of the fear of the sense of inadequacy or incapacity of doing a good job. So whether it's professionally or as a son or as a parent, right, in the Spiritist center, so at work, in relationships, so we doubt, we have some level of doubt on our ability to function. So self-esteem embraces these two categories. And it's very, very deeply connected to the experience of depression that we see today in our society. So like I said, we all share to some extent these feelings of inadequacy, of low self-esteem. And today we have major depressive disorders affecting 14.8 million American adults, or about 6.7% of the population age 18 or old in a given year. And this is old. This is from the Archives of General Psychiatry in 2005, so it's been more than 10 years. So makes us wonder how many more people fall into this category nowadays. And then when we look at clinical depression has some categories that you have to meet in order to be diagnosed with clinical depression, but it will affect the area of emotions, the type of thoughts that one has, a behavior, and even have some physical consequences. But from all these aspects, one that creates a closer relationship with self-esteem is also the type of thoughts that we have. So when we look at the type of thoughts, there is something that's called a negative triad that goes with negative thoughts. And so it includes the perception of self, how you perceive yourself. Am I a good person? Am I a bad person? Right? And also the perception of the world. So you look out there and you say, the world is a dark place. There is no hope for this humanity, right? And the perception of the future. So this is a pretty depressive pattern of thinking, right? When one has a negative perception of the world as it is right now, also has a negative perspective of what the future will look like and will bring, and also a negative perception of the self. Do we always feel good about ourselves? Do you ever have a moment that you feel like horrible, right? Ashamed, perhaps, inadequate? So these are very human feelings that we all share in some extent or another. Okay, so with that introduction, we're going to speak a little bit now about the next topic on the top, which is dignity. Okay? Because let's look at the definition of dignity first. The state or quality of being worth of honor and respect. Okay? So dignity is an important fact when we are looking at self-love. We need to feel that we are worthy of love. And one thing that helps a lot with this sense of dignity is when we identify ourselves as children of God. So spirituality, spiritism, religions in general, they give people this connection with what they are in essence. So who are you? No matter who are you in the present moment, right? In essence, we are all children of God. That means that God one day thought of us, created us out of love. And when God looks at us, God looks and sees the angel that we all will become one day. We are all angels in potentiality. But how often do you feel that? We go on our day to day, right? And we are very stuck in our limitations. And what we do to ourselves is we judge ourselves moment to moment. And we do the same to others. We judge others moment to moment. But our judgment is often disconnected from the essence of who we are. We are children of God. But when you have that, at least in the back of your mind, somewhere within you, that gives you a little bit of a base. That gives you the ground to go through life. And even in the darkest moments, you're able to connect with this certainty. And that helps us to experience. So people who are spiritualists and the scientific world shows us today that people with faith, they have less depression, they commit less suicide, because deep inside, no matter how bad we feel in a given moment, we have that at our core. The belief that we are, each one of us, a child of God. So this certainty is important. It's an important first step to learn to love. Now, what's important to realize in this exercise, right? So if I look at myself in a very dark moment and I'm able to connect with the fact that I am a child of God, what I invite you to do, and this is the difficult part, but it's possible, the more you can do with yourself, the more you'll be able to do with others. When you see someone in a very dark place, try to see that person and to feel that person is a child of God. I'm going to do an exercise so that you don't fall asleep on me. So think about someone that you let's put it this way, don't think very highly of that person for whatever reason, right? So think about that person for a moment. It can be someone in your close life, a difficult relative, a difficult co-worker. It can be a politician, someone out there. Now, I want you to close your eyes, but don't fall asleep. Close your eyes for a second, and you are going to look inside that person's heart. And that face, the face of the person, gradually disappears. And you start to focus and to see in that person a light, which is the presence of God within that person. And then you realize that all the difficulties that that person experiences are only momentary, just like you. And you focus on that, and you come back. And that's it. And that's it. So if you run into someone who is giving you trouble, who is being very difficult, right? You do this exercise. Close your eyes, as if the face of the person fades, and you look past that present moment to see God within. You'll be able to do that more often as you can do that towards yourself. So it's an exercise that goes both ways. This sense of low self-esteem and feeling unworthy is not something new. It's not something that belongs to us only. So when we go back and look at the figures that Jesus invited to be part of his team, as Daniel was speaking earlier today, they all shared these feelings. They're very human. They felt very much like we do on a day-to-day. So he is Mary of Magdalene, right? And in the book Good News, and also in the Preludes of the Kingdom by Amelia Rodriguez that I was citing a little earlier today, the spirits will describe her as someone who was extremely rich. She lived in a palace. Her palace had the best furniture, the best rugs, the most expensive garments she wore. She was beautiful. She was young. She had all the men that she could possibly want. And her servants hear about Jesus. And they tell her that there is a man that talks about love in a way that no other man has ever talked about. And that she should go and meet him. And she said to the servants, "But will he speak to me? Because I am a prostitute." And deep inside, despite of all that she had, she really felt deeply rotten. She felt incredibly ashamed of the life that she led. She felt empty. She felt that she was a sinner. She felt possessed, and she felt condemned. So those were the feelings that she experienced. So she hesitated. She didn't think that Jesus would actually take the time to speak to her, to look at her. And the end of the story is really beautiful, but you gotta read the book. But like her, we also have Peter. And this passage is actually in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5. And it's a well-known passage where Jesus is standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and people were crowding around him, trying to listen to the word of God. And he saw that at the edge of the water, there were two boats that were left by the fishermen that were cleaning their nets. So he goes into the boats, take one that belonged to Peter, and ask him to push the boat a little offshore. And he sits down and he continues to preach from the water. And when he's done, he says to Peter, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. And Peter says, Master, we have worked the entire night and haven't caught anything. But he was a very obedient disciple, so he says, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. And when they had done so, they caught this incredible number of fishes, and the nets began to break. So they signaled so others could come and join them, and brought another boat so that they could bring all the fish back to the shore. So the Gospel of Luke says that when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at the knees, at Jesus' knees, and said, Go away from me, Lord, because I am a sinful man. So he realized the grandiosity of Jesus. He realized what had happened, and he felt like we feel so many times, unworthy of that much love, unworthy of being in the presence of love. And very much like him, we have also a well-known story of Zacchaeus, right? Who is described as a very short man. He was short in stature, but he also was very short morally. He was a tax collector, and he made a lot of this money. He was a very wealthy man, and he made a lot of his money by really stealing from others. So his conscience was conflicted by his own actions. And he was unable to look at Jesus face to face. So what does he do? He climbs a tree. He does not want to be seen, because he too, in his awareness, he knew that he was short and he felt unworthy. So he was unable to face Jesus eye to an eye. He climbs the tree. And of course, Jesus is passing by, and he looks up and he says, Hey, Zacchaeus, what are you doing up there? Come down. I need to go and have a meal with you today still. Right? So, but the point being is that this feeling is a very common feeling. And dignity is an important feeling when it comes to self-love. So the Spirit Dias da Cruz, in the book Pills of Love, he says that dignity is a leverage that provides the creature courage and strength to move towards the Creator. So it is that moment where you feel really bad about yourself, right? But if you feel like you are worthy, that gives you the courage to continue on, to move towards the Creator. Dr. Brené Brown, who is a social worker and has incredible work in the area of shame, she talks about this in a very, very beautiful way. I'm a huge fan of her work. And she says that people who are able to make deep connections with others are people who are able to be vulnerable. And to be vulnerable is to be able to show to others who you are, with your incredible talents, incredible achievements, but also with your fears, with your limitations, with your darkness. And the people who are better able to relate, to build relationships, are the people who are able to be vulnerable, to show themselves as they are. But in order to be vulnerable, we need to believe that although we have our limitations, we're still worthy of love, of belonging. And so the people who have better self-esteem, the people that feel that they are worthy, that have dignity, are the ones who feel that within their humanity, no matter what, no matter where they are, no matter what their temporary limitations are, they are still worthy of love. They're still worthy of belonging. So that's a feeling that we have to cultivate within our souls. And self-love then is the result of it's not mediation. It's meditation and self-analysis. I was talking a little bit about that today, a little earlier, right? So when we study Spiritism, there is a question in the Spirit's book, and I wish I knew the number right now, but I'm not going to remember. But everybody knows. Everybody knows. So the question asks, what is the most efficacious way for us to improve, to grow in life? I'm putting in my own words. And the answer is well known, and every single person says that in their lectures, which is know thyself, right? And we have in the Spiritist movement in general focused tremendously on the answer without paying too much attention on the question, because the question literally is, what is the most efficacious way to grow and to overcome our bad tendencies? The most efficacious way, right? The answer was not study Spiritism. The answer was not pray every day, several times a day. The answer was know thyself, the most efficacious way. Which means that if we come to the Spiritist Center and become PhDs in Spiritism, but like I was saying a little before, we are unable to recognize on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment, our own darkness, then it's like having an incredible treasure on your hand and not being able to use it for anything. So all this knowledge that we have only is going to help us if we have the courage to do the inner work that is asked from us. And in order to do the inner work, we have to be humble. We have to be humble. Spiritists in general have a very bad tendency. Let me put it this way. They heard about pure spirits and angels and this higher category of spirits, and they're in a hurry to become one. And yet, we are still learning to be humans. Humans. So when we are animals, right? Animals, the life of an animal is dominated by instincts, self-preservation, and so the animals live primarily concerned with their own well-being. Am I talking about the animals? Well, that's that. And then humans means that on top of the instinct, we now have intelligence and moral sense. And we are invited, and this is also in the Spirit's book, we invited to use our intelligence and our moral sense to educate our instincts. So it's not that they disappear, but now we have the capacity to domesticate them, to control them, to educate them. And so what makes the difference between, the primary difference between a human being and an animal is that animals react and human beings act. Now I ask you, how much of a human are you? So that gives us something to think about, because way before we want to be angels or mentors of others, we just need to learn that, to be human beings. And let's put things a little bit into perspective, right? Being a human being is dealing with light and darkness. That if God wanted to be differently, God would have done it differently, right? But that's not how God created us. So this human experience is normal, it's necessary, it's okay, it's fine, it's cool. In fact, when you read the gospel and you learn about the different stages of the different realms, and you look about worlds of trials and expiations and regeneration and happy worlds, you're going to see that evil exists all the way up on the scale. It just doesn't exist in the pure realms. But right now we're in trial expiation, so evil prevails over good, matter prevails over spirit. In regeneration, a shift starts to take place. In the good worlds, then you have a prevalence of good, but evil is still there. Now, people, how long is going to be for us to get there? So let's be cool with our humanity. Let's just say, hey, this is it. This is where we are. This is part of evolution. It's little by little, one step at a time. You want to see something super, super cruel? Is when I hear this type of comment. But this person has been a spiritist for so long. I can't believe that he or she is still doing this or acting this way. And every time I hear that, I'm like, really? And I feel like asking the person, how long have you been a spiritist? And how much of what you know you actually do? None of us. None of us. Because one thing is to know, the other thing is to be and to deliver it. It's a process. So why the extent that we get frustrated with people is the extent that we have over ourselves unreasonable expectations. Because that's not how evolution takes place. It's a gradual process that happens in God's times. Of course, we can give a little, do our part and try to accelerate things a little bit. I'll never forget, one day I received a message from my grandmother. And she said to me that it was a very cute way she said, that she could see that there were some tiny, tiny points of light being lit in my heart in this existence, and that I was evolving with turtle steps. Turtle steps, okay. That's great, made me super happy. But as long as I'm going forward, okay, doesn't matter. As long as I leave a little better than I entered, that's going to be victory. And that's all that we should really hope for, because evolution is very, very, very slow. Well, okay, so that being said, we have to have the courage to, I'm trying this tricky thing here that Daniel just taught me. So, and now how do I get out of there? Oh. I got stuck on the self-analysis. So, just, having the courage, understanding that to be human is fine, is where we are, and have the courage to move forward. So, we can, it requires self-acceptance and also self-respect, which we talked a little bit before, which is love with words. So, there are two paths that you can do once you're faced with your own mistakes and shortcomings. So, one of them is when you're unaware or you don't want to see it, right? So you're just going to be stuck on these old patterns and you're going to be unconscious about your own life, which is on the black squares over there. Or you can become aware. Once you become aware, and I gave some examples earlier today of feelings that you have, then you can do two things. You can say to yourself, I'm really a miserable human being. I'm not worth anything. There's no hope for me. I'm not going anywhere. And then you can get into a pattern of guilt and punishment, right? And then you keep just repeating the same behaviors and you are you're not moving. You're stuck in the cycle of punishment, self-punishment, without growing, without evolving. Or you can say to yourself, well, I did this and now you become aware of it, but I love myself, I respect myself, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this experience and I'm going to make it into material for my own growth. That's self-love. So Joana de Angelis in the book, I think it's in the book Mining of Love as well, she says that self-love is our ability to recognize the things that we have accomplished, like Daniel said, very well said this morning. I wouldn't change my 49 year of age that I am today at any given moment for when I was 20. With the exception that I would change the quality of my skin. I think I would want a little bit firmer skin. But other than that, I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't go back. Because although I'm convinced that I'm moving forward at total speed, I have moved forward. And if I look back, so should you feel proud of yourself? Absolutely. There is something called positive pride. So it's not about thinking of yourself more than others. It's about appreciating the only true miracle that can happen in our lives, which is the miracle of transformation. The accomplishments that we do. And so, yes, so self-love is about appreciating what we have learned, and it's about our ability to look at our mistakes with love and respect and take advantage of these mistakes to make amendments and to grow. And again, go back to the very tiny little situations of your life. I was in a professional meeting with a medical director who was very difficult, but maybe I'm difficult too. Maybe we're very similar, and that's why we butt heads, right? And so we had an interaction that I wasn't very, let's put it this way, very polite. So I went home. I could be just completely in denial, unaware of my own behavior, which would be in the middle. I could be on the red side and would just keep punishing myself and thinking how horrible I am. Or I could, as I did, I went home, I didn't sleep well that night, because once you become a spiritist, you also have more insomnia because you lose your peace of mind. And so you go home, you can't sleep, and then the next day you can say, well, I'm not going to do anything about it, or you can say, I'm going to make amendments. And you go back and you say, listen, I didn't speak in a proper way. I would like to apologize. That's it. But it takes a little bit more. You apologize, and then you need to do something good. So take advantage of a moment, because no matter how bad people are, everybody, every single person has something good inside themselves. So you need to take a quality of that person and go to a colleague and say, look how the doctor did this today, so good, and bring her up after putting her down. This is self-love. This is taking a situation that was negative and turning into something good. This is what we learn in Heaven and Hell on the penal code of the future life. What is that gives us back tranquility after we do a mistake? You regret, you repent, and you amend. That's what life is. That's it. So imagine what would have happened if to Saul, when Jesus showed up, right? And after had killed so many Christians, he realized of a huge mistake that he did. What would have happened if he had said, well, I'm not worthy of anything, I should be miserable for the rest of my life? No. He took that opportunity, and the first thing that he said to Jesus, Lord, what would you like me to do? I messed up very badly, so now what? What do I do from now on? This is self-love. We already talked about this. So let me talk a little bit about Peter. Because I don't know here in Chicago, but in Miami, people are very, very, very passionate about Paul of Tarsus. And whether you turn left or right, he's always present in our lectures. And the book Paul and Stephen is one of the most famous books in Spiritism. It's an outstanding book indeed. I love it. I recommend it. But I decided that I want to take a different person to talk about the humanity of the disciples. And I chose for that the figure of Peter. And so let's look a little bit about his humanity so we can see that he wasn't really very different than us. So in the first passage that we find in the Gospel of is the passage that is in this figure here where Jesus is walking over the water, right? And so Jesus, Peter says to Jesus, when he sees Jesus walking, he says, Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come on. So Peter got down out of the boat, starting walk on the water, and came to Jesus. Now, this passage means walking over the water means that he's going through the challenges of life. And he's walking with his eyes on Jesus, his eyes on the source. But then the gospel says that he noticed the strong wind. And when he noticed the strong wind, he felt something that we all feel very often in our lives, whether we realize that or not. He felt fear. He got afraid. And what happened when he got afraid? He sank, right? Fear sinks us. So fear is a very normal, it's a very human feeling, right? So I talk to my children. Children are often fearful. And I said, it's normal to have fear. It's okay. This situation is a new situation. So fear is normal. But now what we do, how we manage the fear. We cannot let the fear sink us, right? So he was a man of little faith. He felt afraid because ultimately fear is lack of faith. You guys know the story of the little boy that was traveling in an airplane. And the airplane starts to shake. There's a huge storm. He's traveling alone. There's an older man right next to him. And the oxygen mask drop. People start to freak out. The man puts his oxygen mask. Look at the boy next to him. The boy's calm. And the man is like super, super scared. And tell the little kid, hey kid, are you okay? He said, yes. And he said, aren't you afraid? He said, no. He said, how come? And he says, the pilot's my father. So that's it. That's it. The pilot is our father. So, but he didn't know that at that time. So he had this very human feeling, the feeling of fear, the feeling of the one who does not know that God is in control of everything. But at the same time that he was very human in his fear, he also had his moments of enlightenment, where he was a medium of the higher spirits. In this moment, we are going to see in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea, he asked his disciple, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you? Jesus said to Peter, who do you say I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so at that time, Jesus will say to him, blessed are you, Simon, son of John, for this was not revealed to you by the flesh and blood, but by my Father who is in heaven. So what those words means that at that moment he had been a medium of the higher spirits who had actually inspired him to give that message, to recognize among all the other disciples who Jesus was. But you know what happened? Literally in the next verse in this passage, the following. From that time on, after these well, let me just go back a little bit. Jesus will say to Peter after he says that, I will tell you that you are Peter, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So he calls him the rock, where he will build his church. And then he starts telling them, the disciples, that he's going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to suffer many things at the hands of the elders, and that he must be killed. So he announces to the disciples that his end was coming. It was close. This happens right after this dialogue here. And so Peter, after he heard these words, he took Jesus aside and said, "Never, Lord, never. This shall never happen to you." And Jesus then said to him, "Go behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, and you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Now look at this. These verses are one next to the other. One next to the other. In one moment, Jesus is telling Peter, "You are the solid rock where I build my kingdom." In the next moment, literally in the next moment, he called him the stumbling block. Because in that moment, Peter did not yet understood the meaning of the kingdom of God, the meaning of the sacrifice, or even the meaning of Jesus' missions. He did not know. Very much like us. There are moments that we are elevated and we are in tune with the higher spirits. There are moments where we seem to forget everything that we know, and the values of this world become everything that we know. There is a moment that we are a rock. There's a moment that we are a stumbling block. When someone comes, for example, for the fraternal counseling and says, "I lost my child, I'm suffering tremendously," right? Let's use him. He had a brilliant future. He was studying to be a doctor. He was handsome. He was young. He was full of potential. And then I say to the person, "Your pain is real. There's no doubt about it. But of which future are you talking about?" Because for us, spiritists, immortalists, we still believe that to be successful in this beloved planet where we live in the conditions that we live in, is a better future than to be free of this physical body that imprisons our spirit. And we have no idea of what the future outside of the body means. We feel deeply sorry that someone who was in prison left before us. Chapter 5 of the Gospel according to Spiritism. 2 friends are in a jail. One leaves, finished their time, completed the sentence. What should the other one do? Say to that person, "No, don't go, because I haven't completed my sentence yet. Stay with me." Is this love? No. This is self-interest. You're thinking of yourself, and you're concerned about your happiness, and you think that the other person should continue to suffer with you. Because it is in the gospel as well that for the spirit to incarnate, to come into this flesh, is death. Is death. But we think that this life is awesome. It is awesome. It gives us the necessary experiences that we need. But when we say that we are deeply sorry because someone had an incredible future, we're really losing sight of what an incredible future really means. And I like to say that we are spiritist materialists, because the spiritist ideas, the spiritist concepts, they float on the surface of our minds, but they are not yet in our guts. So this is Peter, and this is us. One moment we are rocks, another moment we are stumbling blocks, right? So, forgot to pass my slides here. And then you have this moment, right? This very human moment, very instinctive moment. Maybe a little below human, because when they come to take Jesus, right? What does Peter do? He feels threatened, like we do. And what do we do when we feel threatened? We attack. So that's what he does in his humanity. He cuts the ear of the soldier, the animal in us, right? In a good sense, right? The reptile brain that we have, the instinctive brain, the human in him. So there is this slide that I like very much that's called the Simon Peter paradox. And I think it speaks very much about where we are and who we are. And so all these ups and downs that we experience in our lives are just that, are just part of being human. And self-love is the ability to understand that that was God's design. Anyone wants to argue with God? Perhaps offer a better plan? A suggestion? Right? So, if we believe that God kind of knew what he was doing, let's just go along. Embracing our humanity, understanding that the people who became the enlightened spirits that they became, all had their human days. And so the most important thing is for us to, self-love is the ability to embrace our own humanity. The more kind we can be with ourselves, that doesn't mean passive, right? So a lot of times, unfortunately, people come to me and they say, I give up because I have tried so many times to fix this particular trait of my personality, and I am unable. I fail one time after the other, and I feel like I'm not getting anywhere. And I say to them, that's not true. That's not true. Because progress is made that way. We have come from many incarnations on this very, very instinctive type of life, where we are predominantly worried about our own well-being. It's going to take many lives to shift the paradigm internally. And even when you fall, when you don't see any movement, you think that you're stuck in the same place, believe me. Deep inside you, every single fall accumulates to create the momentum where the miracle is going to happen, where you get so incredibly tired of the old patterns that you find within yourself the strength to change. So don't give up on yourself, ever. And to the extent that you can't give up on yourself, don't give up in any other human being. Because no matter, and I think this is one of the most beautiful things about Spiritism. When we look out there and we see people who are so incredibly lost, right? They too are a child of God, and they too will learn. There is hope for every single person in the same way that there is hope for us. And let me just move forward here. And this is from André Moreira in the book Self-Love, which it's an incredible book. And he says, Peter gradually learned to reconcile the opposites in his innermost, loving his shadow and recognizing his light. His conversion was so deep that it has been written that even his dark side healed the sick and the possessed. And a little forward, he says, he became a living letter of Christ's love by embracing himself and by accepting his limitations, conflicts, and pains without letting them paralyze him. On the contrary, he built his fortitude from his weaknesses. So that's what self-love is about. It's about recognizing our limitations embracing our souls kindly, and growing from each mistake. How about us? How about you? Where are you at in this process? And let me finish with this poem by Jung that says, "My soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak, I call you. Are you there? I have returned. I am here again. I have shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I have come to you. I am with you. After long years of long wandering, I have come to you again. Should I tell you everything I have seen, experienced, and drunk in? Or do you not want to hear about all the noise of life in the world? But one thing you must know. The one thing I have learned is that one must live this life. Do you still know me? How long the separation lasted? Everything has become so different. And how did I find you? How strange my journey was. What words should I use to tell you on what twisted path a good star has guided me to you? Give me your hand, my almost forgotten soul. How warm the joy at seeing you again, you long disavowed soul. Life has led me back to you. Let us thank life for the life I have lived, for all the happy and all the sad hours, for every joy, for every sadness. My soul, my journey should continue with you. I will wander with you and ascend to my solitude. So take good care of your souls, and the rest will just follow. Thank you.